Greetings, book lovers everywhere, and welcome to E-Train Talks. I'm your host, E-Train. I'm a 13-year-old literacy advocate, podcast host, and booktuber. And today, it is an amazing day, everybody. It is truly a fabulous day. It's a great day any day, especially when you got books surrounding you. And the books next to me are by an incredible, amazing author who I'm so excited to introduce all of you to. If you don't know who wrote these amazing stories, Chinese Menu and Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, here's a little bit about her. So my author that I'm talking to today, she has changed the ways of storytelling through her incredible imaginative and artistic talent. She creates diverse stories and celebrates Chinese history and folklore and Chinese American culture. She inspires empathy and positive change in the book world and the whole world in reality. She is crafting stories that are opening up storytelling windows and bringing life to reading mirrors. Who am I talking about? Well, I am going to be talking with the Newbery Honoree, the Caldecott Honor-winning author and illustrator, the magical storyteller Grace Lin! Woo!
Hi! What a wonderful introduction. I should have you do all my introductions.
Yeah, I'm so excited you could make time out of your day to talk with me. And everybody tuning in, I was actually lucky enough to hear Grace speak at an author panel last month at my local library. And also, yay, libraries, they're amazing. And it was really inspiring, and I'm so thrilled I have the opportunity to talk with you and share your story.
Yay. Yeah, it's so nice. I'm glad I know we had thought maybe we would do it in person, but I'm really glad we're doing it now because I can relax and we can really
Yeah.
spend the time.
Yeah, it can be a lot easier when it's virtual as well. Like more, yeah, like you said, more relaxing, more
Yeah.
conversation. Yeah.
And that
So,
way you can edit too. So if I go off too much, you can always be like, "Oh, we'll just cut that part off."
yeah. So, of course, I knew that when I started this interview, I knew that we had to talk about Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. And not only because it's a Newbery honoree, which in itself is incredible, but I just loved the book. I mean, the story itself was just so groundbreaking. The question I have for you is, so for those who don't know, your award-winning story Where the Mountain Meets the Moon is the first book that I've read and many other kids my age and even adults that they'd really read in the middle grade world about Chinese folklore and mythology. And I loved every page. In your book, you wrote
Oh,
that you tried something, yeah. So, in your book, you wrote that you tried reading Chinese folklore when you were young, but the translations to English made the stories harder to understand and not very captivating for you. And also, there just wasn't much Chinese folklore for children's literature. So, how and why did you decide to take the stories from your past and your present and write them more enjoyable and understandable for today's middle grade readers?
all right. Wow. Okay, so this might be a really long answer, so I'm
It's
so
okay.
glad to hear that you can edit. So, thank you so much for such lovely words about Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. That book turns 15 years old this year, so
Wow.
it's really exciting to hear that it's still touching readers all over, and I'm so glad to hear that. It means a lot to me. So, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon was inspired by Chinese folklore that I read when I was younger. Now, where I grew up in upstate New York, we were the only Asian family in the area.
Mm.
So I spent most of my childhood trying to pretend that I wasn't Asian, and I really uh, I basically refused to learn anything about my Asian heritage. But my mom was really sad about that,
Mm.
and she saw that I enjoyed reading books, specifically fairy tale books, and so she thought one great way that she could sneak in our Asian culture for me to learn about it would be to put like 6 to 12 Chinese fairy tale books on the bookshelf in the living room. She didn't give them to me because she knew if she gave them to me, I'd just be like, oh, you want me to read these because they're Chinese? Forget it. But she just left them on the bookshelf and hoped that I would find them and read them because I love books so much. Well, my mom was really smart and very sneaky because I did find them and I did read every single one of them. Um, but like you said, I was not really impressed with these Chinese fairy tale books. They were printed on this really cheap paper. They had been roughly translated from Chinese to English. You know, they were actually kind of really boringly written. And so, like I said, I wasn't impressed with them, and I didn't really think that they made that much of an impression on me until many, many years later when I was like in college or past college, and I started realizing that my Asian heritage, which I had rejected so much in my childhood was actually something to cherish and something that I was actually proud of. But the problem was that I had rejected it for so long that I actually didn't really feel like I had any strong connections to it.
Mm.
Um, and so I started thinking about all the things that actually did make me Asian. And the two things that I could really feel Asian about were the stories that I read a long time ago and the food that we ate. And so I went to go travel to China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And when I was traveling there, I would see things that would remind me of the stories that I read when I was in second, third grade. I'd be like, "Oh, there's a dragon. There would be a statue of a dragon." And I'd say, "That's just like the dragon in that story that I read. What happened to that story again? I don't remember." Or like I'd see a palace. I'd be like, "This is like a palace where the magistrate would have lived in. What happened to that story?" Because it'd been such a long time, and those stories didn't have a lot of details to begin with. So I started adding my own details, creating my own characters, mixing up the stories. And so I guess, why did I write the books with those stories? Two reasons. One was because it was my way to reclaim the Asian part of my identity, because I felt like there's a lot of me that doesn't feel like I'm Asian enough, or that I look Asian on the outside and don't have, but I'm not Asian on the inside. So writing those stories was a way for me to feel more Asian. And the other reason was because those stories are actually really, really beautiful stories. But the way they were written in that book, the books that I read I think, didn't do them justice. And I felt like I wanted to try to give those stories justice in the books that I wrote.
I love that answer. And I feel like you really did do them justice. From all the stories that you've shared that I've heard about kids from all over the world just celebrating and cherishing your stories, I think you've made a really big and positive impact on so many kids' lives. And I'm very grateful that you wrote Where the Mountain Meets the Moon and all the stories that you write.
Thanks.
So another thing that I really loved about Where the Mountain Meets the Moon is how it kind of felt like a one beautiful puzzle. You got to put all the pieces together throughout the story, and every tale told was separate, but it's also interesting, compelling, and fun, and eventually, like I said, tied back together. And do you think that there was one part of the story or one story in itself that was more challenging to craft and connect to the rest of your writing than other stories, other tales that you'd written in Where the Mountain Meets the Moon?
Um, in Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, I think that because it was the first novel I'd written in that way, I didn't really, it wasn't challenging in the way that you're asking, like, because I kind of had an idea of where it was all going to fit together as I was writing. I hadn't, I wasn't trying to, I wasn't trying to push myself, I guess. Like now when I write a novel, I'm always trying to push it a little further and further, and it's a lot more challenging. But that one, I was just kind of feeling my way through. So it wasn't challenging in the way that you're asking. I think it was just challenging in the way of any writing any novel for any author, which is still really hard. Don't get me wrong. So it was the parts that um, the the people often ask me about, did I think of it all together? And I did kind of, for Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, I did kind of have an idea of how the stories were all going to fit together. Um, but in some of my other books, I didn't have ideas. Like for When the Sea Turned to Silver, I didn't have ideas of how exactly it was all going to fit together. And so that was a lot more challenging.
Yeah, and I mean, you gotta work from the ground up, and that was like one of your first stories, and especially in the middle grade space. And
Yeah.
I mean, look at you now. You're changing the game. So Min Lee, the protagonist in Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, sets off on a quest to find the old man of the moon and ask him to change her family's fortune. So, in doing research for our talk, I actually learned that many cultures have stories about a man or girl or woman or anybody and the moon.
Yeah.
And will you share what inspired your, I guess, Man of the Moon or Mountain and the Moon tale? And
Sure.
did you uncover new folklore during your writing?
Sure. Actually, the Old Man of the Moon was the new folklore for me, because when I was growing up, the big story was the Moon Lady on the Moon with the
Oh,
rabbit on the moon, because and you'll see that in a lot of my books. I always have the rabbit because in Chinese culture, like all those dark spots on the moon. When we here in the United States, when we look up and we see the dark spots, we see there's always somebody who's like, "Oh, there's the man on the moon," because we think all those dark spots make a man's face. But in China and in many other Asian cultures, when they look up at the moon and they see all the dark spots, they see a rabbit, and they see a rabbit making medicine. And so there's been many stories about that rabbit, and in Chinese culture they call it the jade rabbit. So for me, the Old Man of the Moon was actually more of a new folklore that I discovered when I was in Hong Kong, and there was this statue of this man, this old man with a book, and he had lots and lots of red ribbons all over him. And I was like, "Who is this guy?" And they said, "Oh, that's the Old Man under the Moon." And I read about him, and that is the character of the Old Man on the Moon. The character, most people actually call him the god of marriage in Hong Kong and in Chinese culture, because he has that magic book. And as soon as a baby is born, he opens up his book and he finds out who that baby's going to marry when he or she or they get older. And then he takes one of his red strings and he ties one end of the red string to that new baby's ankle. And then he goes and finds that future spouse somewhere in the world who's hopefully also a baby. He ties the other end of that red string to that future spouse. And so you have these two babies who are connected by this red thread that the Old Man under the Moon has tied. And these babies, this red thread is very magical. Nobody else in the world can see it or touch it. But as these babies grow older and older, the thread between them gets shorter and shorter and shorter and starts pulling them closer and closer together until they eventually meet and they get married. And so that's why most people call him the god of marriage, because it's his red thread that ties together husbands and wives and spouses together. And so, and he always reads his book under the moon. So that's why his other name is the Old Man under the Moon. And so I took him and I kind of changed him a little bit and changed it to the Old Man of the Moon.
I love that. I mean, like I'm kind of taking it in, taking that story in. It's beautiful and um like kind of processing, kind of getting my thoughts right, just trying to find the right words to say because like I feel sort of speechless. I mean, just mythology, folklore, it can just take you to magical storylands. It can real but not also just it's so real. And it might be real, it might not, but it feels so real in your heart.
Yeah, and I think it's such a beautiful idea. The idea, because the I took that idea of the red thread and I pushed it just a little bit further, which a lot of people, it's not original. A lot of people have taken that idea and pushed it further,
Yeah.
where it's not just husband and wife, not just spouses that are tied together by this red thread, but it's anyone you're destined to meet. So anyone who's going to change your life, like it could be your best friend, it could be your uncle, it could be your parents. They've all been tied to you when you were a baby by the red threads that this Old Man under the Moon has tied to you. So I think that's such a beautiful idea that people that people come into your life on purpose by this red thread, like they're drawn to you.
Yeah, I love that. And another question that I have about Where the Mountain Meets the Moon is about Minley's parents. So, they were sort of transformed by the end of the story, especially Ma. And at first, she was not satisfied with the life that she had and what was in front of her as well, or what her fortune said. And later, though, she missed everything she once had and kind of eventually came to truly appreciate her life. And the special lesson could have been lost or not truly felt by your readers as much if not expressed in just the right manner, but you knocked it out of the park.
Oh,
You
great.
perfected it. It was beautiful, and I felt it deep in my soul. I felt that gratitude and understanding. And so the magic happened from the story that Ma told. And what do you want kids to take away from her character?
Oh, it's interesting because I the one thing I might have changed it just a little bit now that so many years have passed,
Right.
because the Ma character, I definitely would keep her definitely all the same thing, but she's pretty hard on herself too. Like
Yeah.
she's like, it was all my fault. Like I would have maybe changed that a little bit. So she's not as hard on herself because I wouldn't want anyone now that I'm old and I'm a mom, I'm like, it's okay, you don't have to be so hard on yourself. But the idea of being grateful for what you have is still remains true and still is something that I feel very strongly about. And I think that originally, when I first did the first draft of Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, I actually didn't have the parents' story. It was just Min Lee's story the whole way through, and you didn't go back and see the parents' story. And it was my editor who said, I think you should show what happens to the parents at home. And I was like, really? But it's boring. They're just staying at home. And she's like, well, well, they're maybe they go on an emotional journey. And I was like, oh, that's true. They probably they have to, otherwise otherwise it makes no sense for them to be happy when Min Lee comes home. And so it was a really important thing to show, and I'm really glad that it resonated with so many people.
Yeah, it's just the transformation and the growth. That's what I love so much in middle grade and so much in your stories. There's just so much character development into beautiful, like kind, deeply kind characters. And another story that I read of yours is called Chinese Menu. It's right here. Chinese Menu, the history, myths, and legends behind your favorite foods. And I discovered it when you talked about it at a Sacramento Public Library event. And I loved it. I mean, you never really think too deeply into the stories of your favorite foods, especially at all restaurants. But learning about them, about Chinese food specifically, it was really fascinating to me. And what can you please share with everybody the story behind the creation of your book? What inspired you to really dive deep into Chinese food?
Sure. Okay. So, Chinese Menu is like it's a little bit hard to explain what kind of book it is until you have the book in front of you, because people are like, "So, is it a cookbook?" And I'm like, "No, it's not a cookbook." They're like, "Is it a picture book?" No, it's not even a not a it's not a picture book. It's not a novel. I try to explain. It's kind of like it's a collection of stories. So tell people, you think about there's these anthologies of Greek myths, right? And like they'll be like the origin of Zeus, the origin of Athena, and I was like, it's just like that, but Chinese food. So you have like the origin of kung pao chicken, the origin of dumplings, it's the story of how each one was created and the story behind them, and they're actually such beautiful stories, full of folklore, myths, legends, dragons, monks, magistrates, and all those things in the stories. And I think a lot of people don't realize how deep and rich the history is behind the Chinese food that we eat at the restaurants here. Um, so the origin of this story of this book came because I did a picture book called Fortune Cookie Fortunes all the way back in like 2002. And while I was doing that picture book, that's when I first learned that fortune cookies are actually a completely Asian American invention. So if you go to China, nobody really knows what a fortune cookie is, and if they do, they're like, "Oh, you mean that American cookie, right?" And uh, I remember I was telling this to all of my friends at the time. I was like, "Oh, do you know that the fortune cookie was invented here in the United States?" And so every time I told people this, they all responded pretty much exactly the same. They'd all say, "Oh, so you mean the fortune cookie's not even really Chinese?" And they always said this with like this real tone of disgust, like, "Ugh, the fortune cookie's not even really Chinese." And the more that people said that, the more I started feeling really bad for the fortune cookie. And the more I started to really relate to the fortune cookie because I told you about how I grew up, right? And I kind of felt like, oh, maybe that's what people say about me. Oh, she's not really Chinese. And I started thinking like, oh, we shouldn't feel that way about the fortune cookie. We should be proud of the fortune cookie. It's probably one of the first Asian American foods. And that's really, really something cool. That's like that's really neat. It's not something to like look down on.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about like how we feel like that about most of the Chinese food we have at the restaurants. Like, oh, is it really Chinese? Is it authentic? And I was like, the Chinese food that we've been eating for centuries and for years here in the United States, um, maybe it's not exactly the same food that they eat in China, but it is authentically Asian American.
Mhm.
And I kind of felt like I wanted to give, just like I wanted to give the fortune cookie more respect, I wanted to give all of this Asian American food more respect. And so that's why I made the book Chinese Menu, to show people that the food that we here in the United States, sometimes they think Chinese food is like cheap food, right? And that has a long history behind the reasons why. But what we might consider cheap food actually has this beautiful, rich history and is worthy of respect. And so that's why I made the book Chinese Menu.
Well, I love this story, and personally, I think, Chinese Menu is way better than any, Greek myth anthology. I love those too, but, I would much rather learn the story of fortune cookies than Zeus because they're so close to home, you know?
It's true. Yeah,
And and they taste good too. And,
and you can
like
eat. You can eat while you're reading the book.
yeah, you can,
You
like
can't
you can eat the foods you're talking about, and, like, when you're eating it, you come to the story and you're like, "Hey, I know your story now."
exactly. You can't eat Zeus.
Yeah, that's true. It's unfortunate, yeah. I mean, every day I wish that I could eat Zeus, but instead, I got Chinese food, so
Yep.
way better in my book. So, yeah, no cannibalism, everybody.
That's true. Though Zeus was guilty of no, it was Zeus's father who was guilty of that,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's true, yeah. So, my favorite Chinese food is jasmine rice, and that's one of the stories that you talked about in it, and my dad's favorite in general, so is chicken and jasmine tea, and my mom, I mean, kinda likes everything, but her favorites are kung pao chicken and sizzling rice soup. So, we
Mm.
all found something that we love in Chinese menu. I feel like every family, every kid can relate to that as well. No matter your culture or race or ethnicity, we can all relate to it, and my question is, how did you set out to research the book? And did your research include eating the dishes that you wrote about? That's some tasty research if it is.
Of course, like, that I mean, my husband was like, "Oh, you're just writing this book so you can eat out Chinese restaurants all the time, can't right?" And I was like, "Well, maybe." But, um but honestly, I had like I said, I had the idea all the way back when, Fortune Cookie Fortunes came out, which I think was 2003, and, since then, I've just been collecting stories slowly, every time there was an interesting story about a food, I'd scribble it down, or I'd copy or print out a article that I'd see or something like that. And I just kind of have been collecting them over and over the years. But when I finally decided to make it into a book, like the real book, my publishers said, "Oh, this is gonna be classified as nonfiction," and I said, nonfiction, because I guess even myths and legends are
Yeah.
classified as nonfiction, and I was like, oh, okay. And so I was like, I better get somebody to help me vet this, because I need to make sure that it was like real, from real Chinese culture, and not just some story that my dad told me like over the like that he made up one night. So I actually hired a research assistant. She was a student at Smith College. Her name's Isabel Brandt. And I went to her and I said, I have all these stories. And I need you to find me secondary sources for each of these stories to make sure that they're really rooted in Chinese legend and history. And so she did, and she found not just secondary, but she would find third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then she'd even find stories that I didn't have that were like much better than the ones that I had. For example, the story of spring rolls, I was going to tell the story of the Spring Festival because that's why they're called spring rolls. But she found the really great story about the minister who could write with two hands, which I'll let
Yeah.
people read in the book. But so she was invaluable. So thank you, Isabel Brandt, if you happen to
Woo!
ever do this.
Yeah, thank you. And you helped create one of my favorite stories, and I feel like with your book, I mean, I understand it being classified as nonfiction, but I still feel like it's one of those nonfiction stories that has a story to it, and you don't find many of those, which I really love.
Yay!
So, I was so happy to find your TEDx talk online. I mean, you spoke about windows and mirrors in literature and your personal story connecting to that, and also just kind of being one of, like you mentioned earlier in the interview, one of the only Asians in your community. And I just related to your TEDx talk so much. I love that you talked about windows and mirrors. It's one of my favorite quotes, one of my favorite ideals in middle grade and just kidlit and just books in general. So
Yeah.
I was hoping you could share a bit about why you decided to focus your art and writing on books that offer mirrors. And also, I guess, well, mirrors for Asian young readers, but also windows for other people into their lives. And I guess a bit of a follow up, if you want to answer, how did you get the opportunity to host a TEDx talk?
Okay, so the TEDx talk was very interesting. That was Natick's first TEDx. So usually, I think for most of the times, you have to try out for those things. But
Mhm.
because it was their first one, I received an invitation from one of the creators, and she who was also in children's literature. She said it'd be great if you talked about windows and mirrors, and because she knew that I talked about it quite often. And so I reached out to Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who is the who wrote the seminal essay "Windows, Mirrors, and
Mhm.
Sliding Glass Doors," and asked her permission to use the metaphor. And she said it was fine. She was like, "It's a metaphor." She kind of felt like it was in the she felt like everybody used it and
Yeah.
that it was completely fine to use. And so with her blessing, I was able to craft my talk around it. And what was really interesting about TEDx talk is that it's really different than a lecture, because every time I tried to put like a fact or a quote in or something like that, they're like, no, 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 this is a story, like all about you. And so that is why the TEDx talk is mainly about me. I think if I had not had the speech coach person be like, no, no, make it about you, I would have made it more like, and then these statistics and all these things that but I think it worked out better this way, because so many people have told me how it really reached them. So I'm really honored that it did. So what and you know so why do whoops sorry about that. So why do I create books that are windows and mirrors? You know, it's just like I said in my talk. When I was younger, I never saw any books with people that look like me in them. The only book with an Asian person I ever saw with him was the Five Chinese Brothers, which is has very stereotypical Asian characters. They're
Mhm.
yellow faced and buck teeth, and the men have all these long pigtails. And I did not relate to those characters at all. In fact, if anything, it only made me more ashamed of being Asian. And this was something that really stuck with me for quite a long time. And it wasn't just books. It was TV, movies, magazines. Back then, there really was nobody that in the media that reflected how I looked. But
Mhm.
books is where I felt it the most, because books is what I loved the most. And so when I grew older and I decided to become a children's book author and illustrator, it was really, really to fulfill that need, like to make that child that I once was happy. So it's kind of selfish in a way. It's like all the books that I wished I had when I was younger were the books that I was making. And at the same time, they're the books that I needed to make to help me feel more Asian. And so those are the things that I hope readers who are Asian feel as well. Like I hope that it's the books that they need so they can feel proud of their heritage. It's the books that make them feel connected to their heritage so they can feel like it's a part of them.
Mhm.
So those are the mirrors that we were talking about. And then there's the windows part. And in my TEDx talk, I talk about how there's the tryouts for the Wizard of Oz. Going
Yeah.
back to the Wizard of Oz or the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, we're not really quite sure. And so, and how all the girls in my class wanted to be Dorothy, and I wanted to try out to be Dorothy too.
Yeah.
But when I asked my friend, "Do you think they might choose me to be Dorothy?" She turned to me and she said, "You can't be Dorothy. Dorothy's not Chinese." It was like so out of her imagination that I could ever play Dorothy. And it was so out of her imagination that I could even be cast in the play because I was Asian, because she had never seen an Asian in a play either, and so these books are really important as windows because it makes people who have always seen themselves realize that that they could see other people,
Yeah,
and that's a really important thing.
it absolutely is important. And that's why I love the saying, windows and mirrors. We need them so much in books, so much in the media, as you mentioned. And so I have a question for you that I'm really excited to ask, and it could be like relating to one of your books or both of them. So I've recently started asking people that I interview if you could share one song that you would say is the soundtrack, like the maybe the theme song from one of your books. Just pick one. It could be, I mean, you could be for Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, Chinese Menu, or you could do one for both, depending on what you want. Yeah, long-winded to a very, very simple question. If you could choose one song that's the theme song for your stories, what would it be and why?
So I know I should probably choose something um, Asian, but the first thing that came to me was there's this song by Pink called "Cover Me in Sunshine."
Oh, I
Um,
like that.
yeah, and it's just this song. My daughter used to sing it when she was younger, and I think that Pink herself wrote it for her daughter too. And it's this idea. It's to me, it's like kind of like covering people with love, right? And so
Yeah,
that's kind of how I want my books to feel like. Like it's I guess it's my way of covering them with love, like
yeah,
the love of stories, the love of all of us, I guess. Love of reading. But like just the love of being human,
right.
I'm kind of like going off on a tangent, but I do feel like there's so many horrible things happening in the world,
Mhm.
and books and there's it's really important to have books that explain those things. It's really important to have books that help people deal with those things and to prepare them for those things, but there's also a place for books to remind people how wonderful and kind and loving humans are, and that we are a race that is not just race, we are a species that is worth being, and so
Right.
that's kind of how I feel what I try to do with my books.
So I'm really sad this is the final question of the interview because I've loved this interview. And so, but this is a question that I ask every single person that I've interviewed. If you could be or meet any literary character, whether your favorite author or your favorite book character, and you can choose someone from your own book, so if it's not cheating. Some people sometimes, oh, it's cheating. That's fine. It's fine. So, who would it be and why?
So a book character or a book
Oh,
author?
either one, whatever,
Okay,
or both.
because I know you sent the question beforehand, and I remember I thought I read author, but in my author, but now that you say character, I will give you both. But the first one I thought of was Natalie Babbitt, who wrote this book called Tuck Everlasting and The Search for Delicious, and I did get the great, wonderful gift of meeting her a long, long time ago, kind of when I was in the very early part of my career.
Mhm.
But I would love to meet with her again because I think her work was just so beautiful and so wonderful. Um, let's see, the other person. I would also really like to meet Beverly Cleary too. I
Oh
think
yeah.
also passed away. And let's see, um, the other person I'd like to meet is L.M. Montgomery, who wrote the Anne of
Mhm.
Green Gables. Though I've read her diaries, and she seems kind of sad, but you can never really tell with diaries because diaries is where you like pour out all
Yeah.
your, your sad things. So maybe she's not really that sad in like when she was alive. So who knows? But I still like to meet her. So those are three authors. Characters. I would love to meet Anne of Anne of Green Gables because when I was growing up, I really felt like she was my friend. Like I felt like she was like my best friend in the world. So I would read those books over and over again. So that's who I'd like to meet as a character. The other characters I'd like to meet, I'd love to meet the family in the Saturdays by Elizabeth Enright because those were another family that I kind of felt like was my friend and were my friends. And I think The last group would probably be Noel Streetfield wrote these books called Ballet Shoes, and there's some girls in that I also felt like were my friends when I was growing up, so I'd like to meet them too.
Yeah. I mean, don't just say that they felt like, they are, because book characters are our friends and books are our friends.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So, I loved all of your answers in this interview, and I mean, I've got to say, I truly, truly admire your enthusiasm and everything you're doing to add a little magic and love into your books and into the book world in itself. So,
Well, I could say the same thing about you,
thank
honestly.
you.
Thank you for putting your enthusiasm into the book world too. I think it's really amazing.
I feel like all these chats, they kind of demonstrate cover me in sunshine because I try to cover everybody watching in book sunshine, and that's what you do with your stories. And
Yay.
yeah, your writing is changing the landscape of books. It's adding so much diversity, so many needed tales, and you're really you're changing kids' lives. And I'm really grateful for what all that you do, all of your writing. You're amazing.
Thank you. Well, I'm really grateful for you too, because you know what? My books are just pieces of paper without a reader. So thank you.
Yeah. So everybody, I hope that you loved this talk. I know I did. And I would say keep on reading. I say that every time, but by keep on reading, you know that I always am going to mean keep on reading, and or if you haven't yet, keep reading and start reading Grace Lin stories. Whether it's Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, whether it's Chinese Menu, or any of her picture books, middle grade stories, you're going to love them. They're going to change your life. And you can find her on her website www.gracelyn.com. And it's all the time that we have for today. So stay safe, keep reading, and I'll see all of you in the next one. Bye bye.
Thanks.